Alright everyone, tonight we're diving into something that shook the foundations of medieval society. Picture this. A lone genius, probably not invited to parties, decides it's time to start charging for things that had been free since forever. So, before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe if you're truly enjoying the content. And drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see our global audience. Before medieval Europe got hooked on taxes, tolls, and general misery, there was the communal bread oven, a truly wholesome institution that peasants could actually rely on. The deal was simple. You brought your pathetic little lump of dough, someone else brought their even sadder dough, and everyone baked together in this oven that looked like it was older than dirt. No fees, no rules, no lord breathing down your neck. Just peasants, soot, and a glimmer of hope in the air. And then disaster struck. One morning, the local lord jolted awake, detecting joy somewhere within his territory. A peasant chuckling, someone whistling a tune, a woman actually admitting she felt content. Unacceptable. That kind of behavior is contagious. So he storms into the village square, glares at the oven as if it owed him back rent, and proclaims, "This is mine now. If you want bread, you pay me." Imagine being a starving farmer in 1140 AD, clutching your dough, listening to a guy who's never touched flour in his life explain that heat is now a luxury item. The peasants blinked in utter confusion, like chickens watching someone build a trebuchet. "But my lord," someone dared to whisper, "the oven belongs to the community." The lord, a man who probably thought grain came prepackaged, simply smiled and said, "Not anymore." Suddenly, baking bread became a premium experience. No coin, no bread. Congratulations. You've unlocked medieval intermittent fasting permanently. Some rebels tried baking at home, but medieval homes were basically flammable suggestions. One little spark and the whole neighborhood would go up in flames like it was auditioning for a scene in Mordor. So even attempting self-sufficiency turned into an arson speedrun. The Lord naturally exploited the situation. If the oven burned your bread, fee. If you burned the oven, bigger fee. If you complained, insolence fee. If you breathed too loudly while waiting in line, unspecified fee that changed daily. What had once been a simple town gathering became a medieval DMV. Long lines, glacial service, and one guy in charge who clearly hated everyone. The peasants adjusted the only way they knew how. Quiet resentment and muttering insults under their breath. Like, "May a goat sneeze into his stew and may his boots be wet forever." But deep down they knew the truth. This was just the beginning. If a lord could charge for baking, he could charge for anything. Walking, existing, looking at birds the wrong way. Medieval Europe had officially entered its villain arc. Before medieval lords figured out how to monetize sunlight and personal happiness, rivers were the one thing peasants could count on. Water flowed freely, fish swam peacefully, and the only real danger was drowning, which, let's be honest, was still preferable to encountering your landlord. Back then, rivers were vital community lifelines. You drank from them, washed in them, dumped questionable things into them, and pretended not to notice your neighbor doing the same. It was a natural, open-access system, perfect for people with zero money, zero rights, and zero energy left. Then, one afternoon, a nobleman on horseback stopped by the river, looked at the water as if it had personally offended his boots, and declared, "This shall now be taxed." Imagine the shock. Peasants froze mid-drink, like medieval deer caught in the headlights. "Taxed, my lord? But the river moves." "Yes," he replied, "and now it moves for me." This is how river tolls were born, the medieval equivalent of charging people for breathing. If you crossed the river, you paid. If you didn't cross the river, sometimes you still paid because, according to the noble, the privilege of potentially crossing someday was worth something. They built wooden toll bridges, even across shallow streams you could easily wade through for free. Try wading instead of using the bridge. Congratulations, you just committed toll evasion, a crime punishable by fines, or, if the guard was bored, a quick drowning demonstration. Peasants tried to argue. But the river belongs to God. Yes, the Lord agreed. And God gave me permission. Now pay. The worst part? Lords didn't clean the rivers. They didn't maintain them. They probably didn't even understand how rivers worked. These were the kind of guys who believed water flowed downhill out of sheer respect for authority. And yet, they taxed it anyway. Some areas got creative. They introduced drinking fees, hydration taxes, fishing fees, fish theft taxes, bridge fees, walking over water taxes, and viewing fees, yes, a scenic observation fee. One village even charged people for letting their livestock think about crossing the river. That's right, cows contemplating the stream were now a taxable event. By the end of the century, rivers that had existed peacefully for millions of years had become medieval ATMs. Except, instead of giving you money, they just took it from you. All because one guy looked at water and thought, how can I make this worse? Long before lords invented the everything tax, peasants had one reliable, peaceful ritual: grinding their grain at home. Every family owned a little hand mill, 2 rocks, some arm strength, and the faint hope that this year's harvest wouldn't taste like soil and despair. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was free, which, in the Middle Ages, made it dangerously suspicious. Enter the medieval lord, a man who couldn't identify a wheat stalk if you smacked him in the face with it. One morning, he heard a horrifying sound drifting across his manor lands. Peasants grinding grain without giving him money. That rhythmic scraping noise? That wasn't industry, that was lost revenue. So he rode into the village, pointed dramatically at everyone's innocent little grinding stones, and declared, "These are now illegal." Just like that, the hand mills, tools peasants had used for generations, became contraband. Owning one was suddenly the medieval equivalent of running an underground casino. Instead, everyone was now forced to bring their grain to the lord's monopoly mill, operated by a guy who definitely didn't wash his hands and definitely judged your grain quality. The process was simple. Carry your heavy sack of grain to the mill, wait behind 20 other miserable people, pay a fee, watch as the miller accidentally keeps the best handfuls for himself, pay a second fee just because he felt like it, and then return home with less flour than you started with and significantly less will to live. Try grinding grain at home anyway? Mill inspectors, yes, those existed, would raid your cottage, confiscate your stones, and fine you for the crime of unauthorized crushing. If they caught you twice, they destroyed your millstones completely, which sounds dramatic until you remember they were just rocks. Breaking them was essentially a public tantrum. One lord even wrote in his records, "The peasants must not grind grain themselves, for independence breeds arrogance." Translated, I can't charge them if they're doing it efficiently. The worst part? The lord's mill didn't exactly work well. It broke often, got stuck, flooded, froze, caught fire, or randomly exploded because nobody understood physics yet. But peasants had no choice. Whether the mill functioned or not, the fee remained consistent. This was medieval innovation at its finest. Take something free, make it worse, charge money, and call it progress. Firewood was the medieval peasant's emotional support system. Cold? Firewood. Hungry? Firewood. Sad about the crushing weight of feudalism? Firewood, and maybe some quiet crying behind the barn. It was the one resource peasants could collect without permission, paperwork, or being lectured about trespassing on the Lord's aura. Fell off trees naturally. God supplied it directly. No middleman needed, which of course meant disaster was imminent. One crisp morning, the local baron, a man who possessed the economic instincts of a parking meter with legs, rode through his forest and spotted something horrifying. A peasant bending over to pick up a stick. A single, pathetic stick. A stick that probably didn't even burn well. And yet, the baron's mind began to vibrate with profit-driven rage. From his perspective, he had just caught someone stealing heat from under his nose. From the peasant's perspective, he had just bent down to pick up a twig like a normal human who doesn't intellectualize branches. Naturally, the baron returned to his manor, poured himself an overpriced goblet of wine, stared at the wall for a few minutes, and had a revelation. What if I owned every stick in this forest? By the end of the week, proclamations went up, declaring the woods protected royal timberland, which was medieval lord speak for, I am now charging money for something I didn't know existed until 7 minutes ago. Peasants were stunned. How could anyone own fallen wood? The trees didn't sign contracts. Gravity did most of the labor. But in the Middle Ages, ownership wasn't about logic. It was about who had the fanciest boots and the least empathy. Soon, collecting firewood required permission from the baron, which he granted generously for a small fee the size of your soul. Peasants trudged into the forest with permits dangling from their belts like sad ornaments, praying they wouldn't run into the baron's guards, men who lurked behind trees, waiting to jump out and yell things like, "Drop the stick, criminal!" Ironically, peasants began collecting firewood illegally at night, sneaking through the forest like underpaid ninjas, gripping twigs as if they were precious jewels. Meanwhile, the baron slept peacefully, dreaming of new ways to charge people for oxygen. Worst of all, if a peasant accidentally picked up a branch that was too fresh, they were accused of cutting live wood. That crime came with punishments so disproportionate you'd think the baron was avenging a fallen family member. And so firewood, once free, abundant, and blessed by nature, became a premium service in the grand medieval tradition of, if peasants need it, charge for it. Walking used to be the one activity medieval peasants could do without consequences. They walked to fields, to markets, to church, to their own doom, all for free. Their entire lifestyle was essentially one long, miserable hike. But even this simple act was deemed too joyful, too liberating, too dangerously independent for the ruling class. It started innocently enough. A baron decided to improve the main road by removing 2 rocks and telling everyone he had modernized infrastructure. Naturally, he then built a wooden gate across it. Not for defense, not for decoration, but for the sole purpose of charging people the privilege of continuing their miserable existence in a straight line. The first peasant to encounter the gate stood in front of it for a full minute, trying to decide whether this was a joke or the beginning of something historically stupid. A guard stepped out, bored, holding a spear that suggested he had not been trained to use it. The guard announced with great ceremony, "To pass, you must pay the road toll." The peasant blinked, confused. Walking was not a luxury. It was the only transportation he had besides collapsing from exhaustion. But the guard insisted. The Lord had declared that his roads needed maintenance, even though the roads consisted of mud sprinkled with hope and occasionally a dead sheep. Soon, every traveler had to pay to pass. Merchants, monks, barefoot children carrying turnips, all lined up to pay money to walk on dirt they had already compacted with their own feet for generations. If you dared to walk around the gate through the grass instead, another guard would appear out of nowhere, as if grown directly from the soil, and demand a fine for unauthorized bypassing of lordly infrastructure. Worse still, some lords added tolls to roads they did not improve, did not own, and had never visited. They simply claimed the ground on the basis that it was visible from their tower on a clear day. If the peasants argued, the lord responded with the medieval version of legal precedent. Because I said so. Soon, walking became an economic gamble. Every trip required planning, budgeting, prayer, and maybe a backup prayer just in case. Peasants even began taking the long way around, sneaking through forests and marshes like fugitives, all to avoid paying a fee for using the earth. Thus, the walking tax became the perfect medieval innovation, turning basic survival into an invoice, because in the Middle Ages even gravity reported to the nobility. Fishing was once the last refuge of the medieval peasant. The river didn't ask questions. It didn't judge their smell. It didn't care about their social class. It simply existed, full of fish who were probably also wondering why humans were always crying nearby. For generations, peasants wandered down to the water, tossed in a crude net, and hoped to catch something other than boots, rocks, or existential despair. Fish was free, not because the Lord allowed it, but because nobody had been imaginative enough yet to charge for animals with no property deeds. And then, one afternoon, a nobleman standing on a bridge got an idea so catastrophic that historians should list it as an official medieval disaster. He watched a peasant haul a wriggling trout from the water, and instead of feeling a human emotion like empathy or good for him, he felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to own the entire river. He declared, in the confident tone of a man who had never been contradicted by reality, "The fish are mine." The peasants stared back at him, stunned, trying to understand how someone could own creatures that lived underwater and had never heard of taxes. But the noble insisted, The river belonged to his land, therefore, everything in it did too. This included fish, frogs, reeds, and likely several confused eels. Fishing became a licensed activity. But medieval licenses weren't pieces of parchment. They were just verbal threats disguised as permissions. The Lord's bailiff patrolled the banks, waiting to catch someone illegally retrieving dinner. If you pulled up a fish without paying, it was considered theft, of course, of something that nature created, and you physically caught with your own hands. Punishments varied. Some peasants were fined. Others had their nets confiscated. A few were dragged before the Lord and lectured about respecting authority, which was arguably worse. If you were caught fishing more than once, the Lord might take your boat, your dignity, or, in extreme cases, your freedom. Because nothing says justice like imprisoning someone for catching a carp. The absurdity didn't stop there. Some lords charged seasonal fishing fees, claiming winter fish were more valuable. Others taxed by species, as if a pike understood its own market worth. One particularly ambitious noble even attempted to tax fish caught by accident, such as those that leapt directly into buckets during storms. Thus, the river, formerly a source of life, became a medieval supermarket where the prices were high, the surveillance was constant, and the fish absolutely did not agree to any of this. Rain was one of the few dependable blessings in the medieval world. It fell from the sky without charging interest. It watered crops, refilled rivers, and gave peasants something to complain about that wasn't hunger, plague, or feudalism. Best of all, it was free, which, in medieval Europe, meant it was living on borrowed time. The trouble began when a particularly entrepreneurial lord looked out his manor window during a storm, noticed the peasants' roofs glistening with fresh rainwater, and felt a deep, unnatural anger that nature had dared to supply hydration without consulting him first. In his mind, water falling on his land was exactly the same as water belonging to him personally. So he announced a new rule with the confidence of a man who had never understood physics. All rain that touches my estate is mine. The peasants, drenched and confused, tried to wrap their heads around this revelation. The sky, to their knowledge, was not part of the Lord's estate. It did not pay rent. It did not attend feudal ceremonies. It simply existed above everyone, aggressively neutral. But the Lord was unmoved. If rain touched your bucket, your barrel, your roof, or your head, you were expected to pay a small fee for unauthorized water collection. In other words, water falling onto your face was now technically a crime. Peasants tried to argue. They pointed at the clouds, at the open sky, at the fact that water was not a sentient employee of the Lord, but medieval logic was a one-way street. The Lord insisted the clouds drifted over his land. Therefore, they were cooperating with him. This was, of course, nonsense. But nonsense is powerful when backed by armed men. People tried collecting rainwater secretly. They hid barrels behind houses. They placed buckets under eaves in the dead of night. They cupped their hands discreetly during storms. But the Lord's guards were relentless, patrolling during rainfall with the same energy modern security uses to chase teenagers out of malls. Some peasants were fined for hoarding moisture. One woman was accused of stealing atmospheric resources. A man was charged after being caught running outside with a bucket during a drizzle. His crime described formally as attempted precipitation theft. In the end, even the weather wasn't free in medieval Europe. Rain itself became part of the feudal economy, a perfect symbol of an age where nature belonged to whoever shouted "mine" loudest while holding a sword. Grass was the one medieval resource that nobody thought to monetize. It grew everywhere, required zero effort, and tasted like disappointment, which made it perfect for cows, goats, sheep, and occasionally desperate peasants during famine. Animals wandered freely across the commons, nibbling as nature intended, blissfully unaware of the economic nightmare about to be created on their behalf. Everything changed the day a nobleman rode past the fields and noticed something terrifying. Peasant livestock grazing for free. His mind, naturally unburdened by morality or agricultural knowledge, began to panic. Free grazing meant free animals. Free animals meant wealth for peasants. And wealth for peasants meant they might start asking questions like, "Why are we starving while you have 12 kitchens?" This could not be allowed. So he invented grazing rights, a term that sounded official but was really just a fancy way of saying, "I'm charging you for the grass that literally grows out of the ground by itself." The announcement was delivered with theatrical gravitas. The Baron declared that all grass, whether standing, partially chewed, or entirely theoretical, belonged exclusively to him. If a cow looked at grass on his land, that was trespassing. If a goat walked near grass, that was attempted theft. If a sheep even thought about grass, the Lord considered that conspiracy. Suddenly, the commons, land historically shared by the entire village, became a legal minefield. Cows could no longer wander. Goats could no longer roam. Shepherds had to escort their animals like overworked security guards, constantly scanning the horizon for the Baron's tax collectors, lurking behind shrubs like medieval paparazzi. Some peasants attempted diplomacy. "My lord," they explained, "this grass has always been free." But the Baron, a man who believed the earth itself answered to his boots, simply replied, "It is free for me." His smile did not reach his eyes, possibly because his eyes had never expressed warmth before. Soon, poor families were spending half their income just to let their animals eat. The irony was staggering. The peasants fed the animals fed the Lord's taxes, and the Lords fed on the satisfaction of turning sunshine, soil, and chlorophyll into a revenue stream. A few rebellious peasants tried sneaking their animals onto common land at night. These moonlit missions looked like undercover heists, except the treasure was grass, and the thieves were exhausted sheep. In the end, medieval grass became one of the most profitable inventions of the Middle Ages, not because it changed, but because someone woke up, looked at a meadow, and shouted the most dangerous word in feudal Europe, "Mine!" If there was one thing medieval peasants depended on more than hope or prayer, it was beer. Not because they loved the taste, medieval beer tasted like anxiety and wet hay, but because water could kill you faster than an invading army. Beer was liquid safety. Beer was hydration with training wheels. Beer was the only beverage a medieval villager could drink without contemplating their imminent funeral. Naturally, this meant the authorities had to ruin it. Home brewing was once a simple, communal ritual. Every household crafted its own weak, cloudy brew using barley, whatever herbs were nearby, and sometimes ingredients that should never have entered a liquid meant for human consumption. But it was theirs, and it was free. Then, one day, a town councilman, whose personality resembled stale bread, realized something horrifying. People were enjoying beer without paying him. This discovery triggered an intense emotional crisis, the kind nobles felt when peasants smiled too long. To fix this tragedy, the council introduced an ale tax, a brilliant invention designed to ensure that the only safe drink in medieval Europe now required government approval. Suddenly, your humble brewing pot transformed from a family tradition into a suspicious object of state interest. Inspectors began prowling through villages, sniffing the air like overworked bloodhounds, searching for the unmistakable smell of unlicensed joy. A woman stirring a pot in her kitchen could be confronted by a sweaty official demanding to know whether she was making soup or engaging in unsanctioned beverage production. There was no correct answer. To brew legally, peasants had to visit the ale conner, a man whose job was to taste beer professionally and whose liver had long since retired. He would decide, with the solemnity of a judge sentencing a criminal, whether your beer was worthy of public consumption. If approved, you paid a fee. If not approved, you still paid a fee. Medieval justice was refreshingly predictable. Brewing without permission became a dangerous underground activity. Families brewed at night behind shuttered windows, praying that their bubbling barley mush wouldn't betray them with a loud hiss at the wrong moment. Children acted as lookouts, watching for the dim glow of the tax collector's lantern. Entire neighborhoods developed a secret network of signals, like birds, but more terrified, just to warn each other when inspectors were approaching. In the end, medieval beer was no longer the humble drink that connected thirsty peasants to survival. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the Middle Ages: corruption, regulation, and the unshakable belief among the elite that joy must always come with a receipt. Forests were once the medieval peasants' closest thing to a spa retreat. They wandered in, collected mushrooms that may or may not kill them, gathered sticks, hunted the occasional rabbit, and enjoyed nature's free offerings, all while praying they wouldn't run into wolves, bandits, or their landlord. It wasn't glamorous, but at least it was free. Then kings and nobles discovered forests. Not the trees, not the ecosystem, not the concept of nature. No, they discovered the possibilities of charging people for touching leaves. Suddenly, vast woodland areas became royal forests, a title that suggested majesty, while actually meaning nobody else is allowed to use this. The announcement came down like a thunderstrike of stupidity. One day, the forest was simply a forest. The next, it was transformed into a sacred, untouchable sanctuary reserved exclusively for the nobility's favorite hobbies: hunting, riding, and pretending they were doing something important. Peasants were stunned. The forest had been their lifeline forever. It provided fuel, food, herbs, and occasionally a quiet place to scream into the void. Now they were told to stay out. They were trapped, unless they wanted to risk fines, imprisonment, or the medieval equivalent of a strongly worded letter, a guard brandishing a spear menacingly. Worse still, the king's deer suddenly held more value than the peasants themselves. Killing a deer without royal permission was considered as grave an offense as treason. In some areas it was a capital crime, while killing a peasant barely warranted a slap on the wrist. If a noble's hunt led to you being trampled, you were expected to apologize for any damage to his horse. The king's hunting parties only exacerbated the situation. Imagine 100 nobles descending upon the forest, trumpets blaring, horses kicking up dirt, and dogs barking as if they were a unionized workforce. Then, after they'd chased every animal 10 miles away, they'd declare the forest overused and impose even stricter bans on peasant access. Some peasants, desperate, would sneak in at night, tiptoeing through the undergrowth like medieval ninjas, gathering herbs in terrified silence. Every snapped twig sounded like a death knell. Every hoot of an owl was mistaken for a guard's shout. And God forbid they should stumble upon a deer. They'd have to feign ignorance, pretend they hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed it, and certainly hadn't entertained any thoughts of hunting it. So, the forest, once a sanctuary of freedom, became another stark symbol of medieval inequality. The trees hadn't changed, but the laws had, and with a mere stroke of a quill, nature itself was transformed into a gated community. Marriage in the medieval world was theoretically simple. Two individuals met, decided they could tolerate each other, and teamed up to survive famine, taxes, and aggressive geese. Not romantic, but efficient, like forming a two-person alliance against a relentlessly hostile universe. Then some lord realized he wasn't getting a cut of something happening on his land. Peasant marriages. The horror. Two people forming a household without paying him first. Scandalous, dangerous, potentially revolutionary. So, naturally, he invented the marriage fee because nothing says love like a financial penalty. This fee was called merchet, a term that sounds like a harmless little pastry, but really meant pay me, or your daughter is legally confined to your house. Yes, medieval lords essentially charged fathers for the privilege of allowing their daughters to marry someone else. Imagine a weary farmer scraping together meager coins, not for a wedding feast, but for the right to legally stop feeding his adult child. It was the most absurdly medieval financial transaction imaginable. The kicker? This fee had nothing to do with the actual wedding. You still needed money for food, clothing, ale, and the priest, who was already perfecting his disappointed expression. The merchet was simply the Lord's way of announcing, "I see you're experiencing happiness. Please pay to continue." Some lords took this role way too seriously. They kept detailed lists of eligible women as if running an incredibly creepy matchmaking service. If a daughter married without the fee being paid, the lord could fine the entire family, refuse to recognize the marriage, or, in extreme cases, forcibly return her to her father's house, which understandably put a damper on the honeymoon. Peasants did try to resist. Some brave souls attempted secret nighttime weddings, officiated by sympathetic monks who had long abandoned earthly logic. But secrecy was hard to maintain in villages where walls were thin enough to hear a fly sneeze. News traveled fast. So did the lord's tax collectors. The worst cases involved widows. If a widow remarried, she often owed another fee, because apparently surviving one husband wasn't challenging enough. Medieval bureaucracy was determined to charge you for every milestone. Birth, marriage, death, and anything resembling fun in between. In the end, marriage, a simple human union, became another medieval paywall. Love might have been free, but legally expressing it required small coins, monumental patience, and a lord who hovered over your happiness like a hawk with a serious case of financial anxiety. Bridges in the medieval world began as simple structures. A few planks across a stream, often built by monks who had nothing better to do between praying and debating the sinfulness of cheese. These bridges allowed peasants to cross rivers without drowning, freezing, or being swept away like leaves with poor financial planning. They were free, functional, and sometimes even sturdy, three qualities that immediately aroused suspicion in the minds of lords. The moment a nobleman realized peasants were safely crossing water without paying for it, he had a spiritual awakening. He looked at that humble wooden bridge and saw not a public good, but a missed revenue stream. Within days, a gate appeared at one end, along with a guard who treated this 6-foot-wide structure like the entrance to a royal palace. Suddenly, crossing the bridge required payment, not because it needed repairs, it always needed repairs, nor because it improved safety, it never improved safety, but because the Lord decreed that convenience was a luxury. Peasants attempting to cross were intercepted by a guard who asked with tragic seriousness, "Toll, please," as if demanding payment for walking across a glorified wooden toothpick was the most natural thing in the world. If a peasant dared ask why the toll existed, the guard would look at them with the defeated eyes of a man who had asked the same question himself and deeply regretted the consequences. The official explanation was bridge maintenance, which was ironic considering the bridge hadn't been maintained since the day it was built. Half the planks were loose, the other half were rotting, and the whole thing wobbled like it had a personal vendetta against gravity. Some peasants tried to ford the river instead, believing drowning was preferable to paying the toll, but the Lord anticipated this. Anyone caught crossing through the water was fined for illegal bypassing of authorized infrastructure, proving yet again that medieval laws were written by people who had never paid a bill in their lives. The tolls were outrageous. A farmer could cross and lose a week's wages. A merchant could cross with goods and lose a month's profits. Even a cow could cross and somehow be charged, leading to the absurd spectacle of livestock in debt. In the end, the bridge became a perfect medieval metaphor. Flimsy, overpriced, barely functional, and somehow still generating profit for the one person who never used it. Medieval peasants lived lives defined by three basic actions: grinding grain, baking bread, and brewing beer. These weren't hobbies. They were survival skills. The holy trinity of, "Please don't let me die this winter." For generations, peasants handled these tasks themselves, using tools made from stones, wood, and sheer desperation. Everything worked well enough, which, of course, meant that some noble was bound to ruin it all. The trouble started when a baron, burdened with free time and a complete lack of empathy, realized peasants were performing essential life functions without consulting him first. He watched them grind grain, bake bread, and brew beer, and instead of thinking, "How industrious," he thought, "How dare they?" His solution was simple: turn each basic survival task into a taxable event. First came the milling monopoly, forcing peasants to grind their grain at the Lord's mill, operated with all the grace of a collapsing wagon. Then came the oven tax, transforming communal baking into a bureaucratic ritual overseen by a man who probably couldn't tell flour from dust. And finally, the ale regulations, requiring permission to brew the only beverage safe to drink without writing your last will and testament. Each process became a miniature nightmare. A villager trying to grind grain had to trudge to the Lord's mill, wait in line, lose a portion of their flour to spillage, and pay a fee large enough to make them question if bread was even emotionally worth it. Baking required navigating the whims of the oven keeper, who acted like he was guarding the gates of heaven rather than a glorified fire pit. Brewing beer demanded an audience with the ale inspector, a man whose sole qualification seemed to be his ability to consume suspicious amounts of questionable liquid. Peasants soon realized they weren't paying for services. They were paying for permission to exist. Even attempting to perform these tasks at home became a crime. A woman caught brewing beer in her own kitchen was fined for unauthorized fermentation, a charge that sounded scientific but was really just the Lord's way of saying, stop being resourceful. If someone baked bread secretly, smoke rising from their chimney was treated like a distress signal, except the only people arriving were tax collectors. Together, this triple tax system formed a perfect medieval trap. No milling, no flour, no flour, no baking, no baking, no bread, no life, and the Lord collected revenue at every stage. It was the original subscription model, except with more hunger, more surveillance, and significantly worse customer support. Medieval markets started as wholesome, chaotic gatherings where peasants shouted prices, chickens escaped frequently, and nobody had any concept of sanitation. They were loud, messy, and filled with the aroma of unwashed bodies and vegetables that were technically edible. Best of all, they were free to enter. You could walk in, set up a cloth on the ground, and sell your onions with the confidence of a capitalist who owned absolutely nothing. Naturally, this couldn't last. One day, a lord stood on his balcony, looked down at the lively marketplace, and felt a sharp pang of personal pain, the pain of watching people trade goods without paying him first. Free enterprise on his dirt? Bold, dangerous, unacceptable. So he installed a market gate, hired a perpetually irritated man to guard it, and announced that everyone entering the market now owed a stall fee. Overnight, every peasant selling turnips was transformed into a reluctant taxpayer. This was just the beginning, of course. Medieval fees multiplied faster than bedbugs in a monastery. First, there was the entrance fee because apparently just walking into the market required financial commitment. Then the space fee because your 1 square meter of dirt was suddenly premium real estate. Then the merchant fee, for the Lord's generous act of letting you breathe his air while selling your produce. He had successfully monetized existence. The peasants adapted as best they could. Some squeezed 3 families' goods onto a single cloth to save money, creating a shopping experience so cramped it resembled a medieval thrift store designed by someone who hated joy. Others tried entering the market early to avoid the collectors, only to find that the collectors slept at the gate like dedicated trolls. The worst part was that the Lord offered no services in exchange. The ground was uneven, the stalls were crooked, the smell was catastrophic, and nobody felt safe. Bandits wandered the aisles like confused customers. Stray dogs stole sausages directly from tables. Chickens launched escape attempts with surprising intelligence. Yet the fees kept rising. A few daring peasants attempted to form unofficial markets in nearby meadows where trading was free and spirits were high. Naturally, the Lord shut these down immediately, declaring them illegal gatherings, medieval code for, "You forgot to pay me." By the end of it all, medieval markets transformed from simple communal gatherings into early prototypes of shopping malls. Crowded, overpriced, and controlled entirely by someone who never shopped there. By the end of the Middle Ages, one truth had become painfully obvious. Nothing remained free for long. If something brought comfort, relief, or the faintest glimmer of joy to peasants, it was only a matter of time before a nobleman appeared, holding a scroll and a smirk, ready to slap a fee on it with the enthusiasm of a man who had never worked a day in his life. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping infestation of ownership, a word medieval lords applied liberally to anything they could physically stand near. Bread ovens, rivers, forests, grass, bridges, beer, markets, marriages, all once free, all eventually converted into revenue streams for people whose job description was essentially, be wealthy. At first, peasants resisted, quietly of course, because the Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their tolerance of public-spirited debate. They whispered complaints, rolled their eyes behind haystacks, and invented surprisingly creative insults involving goats. But resistance was futile. Lords discovered early on that peasants needed things. And if peasants needed things, they could be charged for them. In fact, they should be charged for them. It was practically a divine obligation. By the final centuries of medieval life, the logic had become tragically circular. If something existed, it belonged to the Lord. If it didn't belong to the Lord, he claimed it. If he claimed it, he charged for it. If peasants objected, he fined them for objecting. The system fed itself like a snake made entirely of taxes. Even absurdity had limits, but medieval Europe consistently found new ones. One noble claimed ownership of the local sunrise because it appears over my land. Another attempted to tax shadows cast by buildings. A third proposed charging peasants for the privilege of using the road outside their own homes. That one didn't catch on, but only because the collectors couldn't figure out how to invoice sunlight. Eventually, peasants accepted their fate with the weary resignation of people who had been chronically disappointed by life since birth. They lived, worked, suffered, paid, and prayed that the next generation might be charged slightly less aggressively for breathing. Little did they know that the future would invent parking meters, subscription fees, and airline baggage charges, proof that while the Middle Ages eventually ended, the mindset behind medieval taxation absolutely did not. And that, more than anything, is the real legacy of medieval Europe. Everything was free until one idiot charged everyone, and humanity has been paying ever since. Legio ex Fretensis did not emerge from the calm, orderly machine people imagine when they hear Roman legion. No, its birth was violent, messy, and soaked in the saltwater spray that gave the legion its famous name. Fretensis meant of the Strait, a nod to the Strait of Messina, where the unit's earliest soldiers first proved they could fight on land, sea, and anywhere in between. From its very beginning, Legio ex Fretensis was shaped not by parade grounds and marble cities, but by storms, blades, and the chaotic geography of the Mediterranean world. The legion was originally crafted under Julius Caesar, a man who loved two things above all: glory and legions that made him look unstoppable. If Caesar gave a unit his personal approval, it meant it was ruthless, disciplined, and dangerously efficient. Legio X quickly became one of his favorites. And being Caesar's favorite came with perks like better pay, better camp positions, and a reputation that made enemies tremble, but also responsibilities, such as winning battles that no sane commander should have asked humans to fight. Early on, the men of Legio X earned their name in the naval theater of the civil wars. It wasn't common for Roman legions to fight at sea, but Caesar didn't care. If he needed infantrymen to sprint across the deck of a ship during a storm and hack apart Pompeian sailors, he expected Legio X to smile, salute, and do it. They did exactly that. Their identity, half soldier, half sea beast, began there, carved into their pride as deeply as into their shields. They were also known for a symbol that captured their character perfectly: the wild boar. Not a noble eagle, not a mythic creature. No, a boar. The kind of animal that charges headfirst into danger, refuses to die cleanly, and leaves scars on anyone foolish enough to corner it. The men of Legio X liked this symbolism. It matched their nature. Stubborn, fearless, and always ready to smash through anything keeping them from their objective. By the time the first century of the empire rolled in, Legio ex Fretensis had already built a reputation as one of Rome's most aggressive and reliable legions. Loyal to a fault, brutal when ordered, and impossible to intimidate. They marched wherever the emperors pointed. Toward deserts, mountains, and, in time, the explosive province of Judea, where their legend would solidify forever. By the time Legio ex Fretensis received orders to leave the Mediterranean world behind and march into the unpredictable furnace of Judea, they were no longer just Caesar's old shock troops. They were a hardened instrument of imperial will. Years of civil wars, frontier policing, and imperial reshuffling had conditioned them into something colder than loyalty and sharper than discipline. They were a legion that expected trouble and felt insulted if a province failed to provide any. Judea, however, was not going to disappoint them. The province was already simmering when Legio X arrived. Local tensions, religious divisions, and Rome's talent for overtaxing everyone had created a pot ready to boil over. Even from a distance, the legionaries knew they were walking into a storm. Rumors traveled faster than marching columns, stories of uprisings, ambushes, fanatical rebels, and towns that refused to stay conquered. It wasn't the peaceful retirement post older soldiers joked about. It was a powder keg, and Legio X, as usual, brought the spark. Under the command of generals who trusted force more than diplomacy, the legion marched south, passing through landscapes that felt increasingly foreign. The breezy coasts and fertile plains of the Mediterranean were replaced by harsh hills, scorching sun, and fortresses clinging to cliffs like stubborn barnacles. Many Roman soldiers disliked Judea instantly. It was hot, dry, and full of people who refused to be impressed by Roman armor. But Legio X wasn't there to make friends. They were there to impose silence on a land that resisted silence. The legion established its early positions in coastal strongholds such as Caesarea, but their true crucible would lie inland. The province was fractured into pockets of resistance, some small, some frighteningly organized. Every hill seemed to have a lookout, and every road had the potential for trouble. Patrols were attacked, supply lines were harassed, scouts vanished. In Roman terms, this meant only one thing: a full-scale rebellion was coming. And when it hit, Rome would answer with overwhelming force. Legio X was soon assigned to the incoming imperial commander, Titus, son of the emperor, ambitious, strategic, and perfectly willing to break a city if it wouldn't obey. The men of the legion sharpened their blades, oiled their armor, and prepared for a campaign that, even by Roman standards, promised brutality. They were marching toward the heart of the revolt, toward Jerusalem, toward a siege that would turn their name, once associated with Caesar's naval daring, into a symbol of destruction carved into the memory of an entire region. When Legio X Fretensis finally stood before Jerusalem, they saw not just a city, but a fortress layered in stone, faith, and defiance. The rebels had turned every wall, tower, and gate into a declaration of resistance. For the legionaries, who had fought in deserts, forests, and coastal straits, Jerusalem presented a new kind of challenge, one that was equal parts military puzzle and psychological war. The city meant everything to its defenders, and that kind of devotion often made sieges far uglier than Rome preferred. Titus knew this. He understood that the rebellion wouldn't be crushed by speed or dramatic charges, but by patience and precision. And so, Legio X, along with the other legions marching under his banner, set about doing what Rome did best: turning a city into a cage. The first step was encirclement. No one would leave, no one would enter. Food and hope would begin to dry up together. Legio X was positioned on the Mount of Olives, east of the city, close enough to see the walls, the temples, the markets, even the rooftops where watchers stood like statues. From there, the legion's engineers wasted no time. They began constructing siege camps, watchtowers, palisades, and artillery platforms. The thud of hammers, the groan of wood, and the grinding of stone echoed across the hills. The rebels could see it happening, and the psychological pressure built with every structure completed. But the defenders weren't idle. They launched sorties, sudden vicious attacks meant to disrupt the Roman works. Legio X found itself in constant skirmishes. One moment they were building ramps, the next they were grabbing shields to repel screaming fighters charging down the slope. The rebels fought with a ferocity that impressed even the hardened veterans of the legion. These weren't disorganized raiders. They were desperate, skilled, and intimately familiar with their terrain. Still, Legio X pressed on. Their artillery crews brought up ballistae and scorpions, machines capable of launching bolts and stones with enough force to impale a man through a shield. The legion began hurling projectiles into the city, not just to damage structures, but to wear down morale. Each strike was a reminder. Rome had come to end this rebellion, and Legio X intended to finish the job. The siege was only in its opening phase, but the pattern was already clear: an unstoppable machine tightening its grip. The city might have walls, but Legio X had time, iron, and an emperor's patience. And in a Roman siege, patience was often the deadliest weapon. As the siege stretched on, Legio X Fretensis settled into the rhythm of slow, methodical destruction. Sieges were not glamorous. They were grinding contests of endurance. But for a legion with decades of brutal experience, this was familiar ground. The men of Legio X understood that every hour spent building, hammering, dragging stone, or firing artillery was another thread tightening around Jerusalem's throat. The city's outer defenses were formidable. The rebels had fortified them with fresh masonry, watchtowers, barricades, and a determination born from faith and desperation. Legio X Fretensis, stationed on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, had one specific task: weaken the eastern walls until they cracked open like a clay pot under a hammer. But the defenders knew the terrain better and launched constant attacks from the gates and hidden paths. The legionaries found themselves fighting in chaotic bursts, short, vicious clashes that left dust, blood, and broken tools scattered across the ground. The Romans responded the only way they knew how, by bringing in heavier equipment. Engineers from Legio X constructed towering siege platforms known as agers, as well as massive battering rams coated with wet hides to prevent them from being set on fire. The defenders hurled burning torches, pots of pitch, and even molten substances at them, but the legionaries kept pushing. Every step the rams advanced felt like pushing against the heartbeat of the city itself. Meanwhile, Roman artillery crews worked tirelessly. Ballistae snapped, scorpions twanged, and stones crashed against the walls. Each impact chipped away at the defenders' confidence. The rebels retaliated with slings, arrows, and curses shouted from the battlements. Yet Legio X simply adjusted formation, raised shields, and marched forward again. This relentlessness, cold, disciplined, mechanical, was what terrified Rome's enemies far more than their weapons. Eventually, the constant bombardment paid off. Cracks spidered through the masonry, stones loosened, sections of the wall sagged under their own weight. The defenders scrambled to reinforce weak points, stacking debris and timbers in a frantic attempt to keep Roman steel out. But the legionaries could smell collapse. They felt it in the trembling ground and saw it in the bulging foundations. Every legionary knew what came next. Once the walls gave way, the battle would shift from engineering to slaughter. Street fighting, house to house, temple to courtyard. Jerusalem would become a maze, and Legio X Fretensis would be the torch carried through it. The walls were failing, and the legion was ready to enter. When the walls finally buckled and sections collapsed into heaps of rubble, a roar went up, not just from Legio X Fretensis, but from every Roman soldier who understood what a breached wall meant. It was the signal that the siege, Legio X Fretensis, had entered its most perilous and crucial phase. The fighting was now shifting into the heart of Jerusalem, where every wall, alleyway, and sacred space would be transformed into a battleground. Unlike the open terrain they were accustomed to, the city's intricate interior strongly favored the defenders. Initially, Legio X advanced with extreme caution. They had experience fighting in cities before, Alexandria, Cyrene, and various smaller, rebellious towns. However, Jerusalem was different. Its layout was a bewildering labyrinth of courtyards, narrow, winding streets, sudden staircases, rooftop pathways, and heavily fortified compounds. The rebels exploited this treacherous terrain as if it were a weapon. Every turn concealed a hidden slinger, every doorway a spearman ready to strike, and every rooftop threatened a shower of stones. The legionaries, rigorously trained for open-field formation combat, were forced to adapt quickly. Their shields became makeshift roofs, their formations were reduced to small, adaptable units, and their movements became slow and meticulously deliberate. Smoke soon added to the already chaotic scene. Fires erupted as artillery stones slammed into buildings, torches were hurled indiscriminately, and fierce combat spilled into homes and marketplaces. The city began to suffocate, consumed by its own burning innards. This inferno further reduced visibility for Legio X, but it also sowed panic among the defenders. Fire was indiscriminate, consuming rebels and Romans alike, destroying hiding places, collapsing roofs, and forcing fighters into the open. Despite the ever-present danger, the legion pressed onward. Their unwavering discipline held them together like the strongest iron hinges in a raging storm. Officers bellowed orders above the screams and crackling flames, and horns signaled movements between the maze of alleys. Ballista crews strategically repositioned themselves wherever they could find a clear line of sight into the deeper sections of the city. Even amidst the suffocating smoke, the legions bore emblem, boldly carved into shields blackened by soot, moved steadily forward. Jerusalem fought back with the raw desperation of a cornered animal. Rebels launched ambushes from hidden tunnels, archers rained down arrows from the temple walls, and groups of defenders hurled stones from rooftops until Roman troops stormed the stairs and ruthlessly cleared them. The city's sacred geography, its temples, bustling marketplaces, and holy courtyards, became the scenes of intense, close-quarters combat. But Legio X possessed something the rebels desperately lacked: an unshakable certainty of victory. Rome simply did not retreat within cities. Rome consumed them entirely. With each street conquered, every barricade crushed, and every fire consuming another pocket of resistance, Legio X relentlessly advanced deeper into the heart of Jerusalem. The labyrinth was ablaze, and the legion was the very flame that walked through it. As Legio X Fretensis relentlessly fought its way deeper into the ravaged city of Jerusalem, all roads, burning, ruined, and blood-soaked, converged upon a single pivotal point: the temple. The defenders regarded it not merely as a fortress, but as the spiritual epicenter of their world, the last anchor holding their dwindling morale together. Should the temple fall, the revolt would collapse entirely. If it stood defiant, Rome's victory would remain incomplete, forever tarnished. This made the next stage of the battle inevitable: a clash not just for a physical structure, but for the very emotional core of an entire people. Titus, fully understanding the symbolic explosion this confrontation would trigger, initially desired the temple's preservation. A destroyed holy site would serve as a permanent monument to resentment, while a captured one would stand as undeniable proof of Roman superiority. However, wars have a way of disregarding the carefully laid plans of commanders, particularly when fire, fear, and exhausted soldiers were all mixed together within a city already half consumed by ashes. Legio X advanced along the eastern approaches, relentlessly pushing through barricades constructed from overturned carts, smashed furniture, and shattered columns. The defenders fought back with renewed and desperate fury. This was no longer about territory. It was about the very survival of their identity. Every rebel who charged forward knew he was buying only a few more precious minutes for the temple behind him. The legionaries, shields emblazoned with their insignia, pressed forward regardless. As the fighting intensified around the outer courts, flames from nearby structures licked dangerously close. Arrows whistled overhead, and stones crashed down from the upper levels. Roman soldiers hacked through doorways and splintered gates, systematically clearing rooms and corridors one by one. It was a brutal, suffocating fight. Gone were any grand formations or open-field tactics, replaced by the grinding push of shields and blades within sacred halls. Somewhere amidst the chaos, a stray spark landed where it should not have. Ancient wood, dry from the relentless summer heat, instantly ignited. The fire leaped from beam to beam, rapidly accelerated by the wind, debris, and sheer terror. Within moments, flames were crawling up pillars and racing across ceilings. The defenders screamed desperately for water, while the Romans frantically begged for order, but the ravenous blaze no longer heeded any command. Legio X attempted to contain the inferno, but war had no interest in preservation. As the fire roared higher and higher, rebels attacked with wild abandon, desperately attempting to both repel the Romans and save their beloved temple. The legionaries fought them off step by step until collapsing floors and choking smoke made the outcome unavoidable. The temple burned, a sacred symbol reduced to ashes, its collapse echoing across the hills like a final, shattering truth. Jerusalem's fate was irrevocably sealed. Legio X Fretensis had witnessed the death of a civilization's heart. And yet, the battle was still far from over. With the temple reduced to a smoldering skeleton and Jerusalem gasping for air under suffocating layers of ash, Legio X Fretensis found itself embroiled in the final, most stubborn phase of the campaign, hunting down the remaining pockets of resistance that stubbornly refused to surrender. The destruction of the city's heart had shattered the revolt's unity, but it had not diminished the unwavering determination of its survivors. Many defenders retreated into fortified quarters, hidden underground passages, and concealed chambers, determined to make one last, defiant stand. For the legion, this meant the siege had morphed into a grim manhunt. The very nature of the fighting changed drastically. Gone were the amassed charges and open clashes. Instead, Legio X meticulously entered a treacherous warren of debris, shattered columns, collapsed roofs, and claustrophobic tunnels. Every shadow could conceal a lurking enemy, and every corner presented a potential ambush. These surviving rebels fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. Some hurled themselves at Roman shields with makeshift weapons, while others set cunning traps or launched sudden, desperate attacks from piles of rubble. It was unpredictable, exhausting work, a true urban jungle of smoke and stone. But if there was one thing Legio X excelled at, it was systematic destruction. They moved through the ruins like a cold, relentless tide, clearing block by block. Engineers collapsed tunnels, sealed hidden rooms, and breached walls to expose the fighters inside. Scouts carefully mapped the remaining strongholds. Artillery crews fired short-range shots to pulverize stubborn pockets of resistance, and the infantrymen, grim, soot-blackened, and unwavering, pressed forward with the quiet certainty of men who knew this was the final act. The rebels clustered especially around the upper city, the last major bastion of organized resistance. It was a district of wealthy homes, massive stone structures, and formidable defenses, but that only delayed the inevitable. Legio X Fortensis approached with a terrifying combination of discipline and brutality. They fought up staircases slick with dust and blood, advanced across rooftops held by desperate archers, and battered down gates reinforced with furniture, beams, and anything else the defenders could scavenge. Slowly but surely, the last pockets of resistance crumbled. Some rebels surrendered, starved, exhausted, and with hollow eyes, while others fought to their final breath, refusing to allow the Romans to take them alive. Legio X Fortensis recorded no triumph in these final, brutal kills. It was simply work, grim and necessary. The city that had once defied them was now a lifeless carcass of fallen walls, burnt sanctuaries, and silent streets. By the time the upper city finally collapsed, resistance in Jerusalem was effectively dead. The revolt had been severed at every limb, every artery cut, and Legio X Fortensis, its shield scorched and its boar emblem blackened by smoke, stood as one of the primary executioners of Rome's will. The siege was over, but their role in Judea, and the chilling legend that followed, was far from finished. With Jerusalem crushed and the revolt shattered, most legions would have marched home or been redeployed to other theaters of war. But Legio X Fortensis was not done with Judea, not by a long shot. Rome needed a permanent reminder for the region, something far more persuasive than taxes and governors. They needed a physical embodiment of fear, discipline, and the harsh consequences of rebellion, and the emperor chose the perfect instrument, the very legion that had broken the rebellion. Legio X Fortensis would remain in Judea as its iron shadow. Their new headquarters was established at Jerusalem itself, or rather what was left of it. The city, now a ruin of blackened stones and skeletal structures, had lost its former role as a cultural and religious center. But for Legio X, this ruin was not a tragedy. It was a fortress. They established themselves on the western hill, building barracks, workshops, granaries, and massive walls over the still smoldering remains. Roman camps were not temporary encampments. They were living organisms that grew, hardened, and transformed the landscape. Soon, the boar insignia flew proudly over ground that had once been considered sacred. Their very presence changed the rhythm of Judea entirely. Patrols marched along the roads daily, watchtowers sprang up along major routes, and checkpoints meticulously monitored movement between towns. Rebellious settlements were subjected to intense scrutiny, while peaceful ones were taxed and surveyed. The legion became the very backbone of Roman control, a constant and brutal reminder that resistance was not merely futile, but suicidal. And Legio X handled the job with the cold efficiency that Rome expected. They swiftly and decisively put down minor uprisings, escorted officials, guarded vital supply caravans, enforced laws, and constructed critical infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, and fortified posts spread outwards, all bearing the unmistakable stamp of Roman engineering. Even people who had never laid eyes on a Roman soldier could feel their pervasive influence in the very stone beneath their feet. But their duties weren't limited to policing. They remained a fully operational military unit first and foremost, trained to respond to larger threats. When the first sparks of the Bar Kokhba revolt began to flicker decades later, Legio Exfratensis was still there, its veterans scarred and relentless, and its recruits raised in the chilling shadow of Jerusalem's ashes. This new rebellion would prove to be one of the fiercest Rome had ever faced, and Legio X would once again be at the very center of the bloody conflict. For now, though, the region simmered in uneasy submission. Markets tentatively reopened, caravans cautiously returned, and Rome began ruthlessly reshaping the province in its own image. But the people never forgot what had happened, or who had been responsible. Legio Exfratensis had become more than just a legion. It was an occupying force, a constant warning, and a terrifying symbol etched into the very land itself. Their work in Judea was not ending. It was evolving into something even more sinister. By the time Legio Exfratensis finally relinquished its long station in Judea, generations had come and gone. New emperors had risen and fallen, and cities elsewhere had flourished, crumbled, and been rebuilt again. But in Judea, the chilling shadow of the legion remained heavy, even after its boots were no longer on the ground. Few legions in Roman history shaped a region so profoundly and so violently as Legio Exfratensis. Their role in crushing the Great Revolt had already etched their name into the annals of history, but what came after made their legacy even harder to erase. They became the instruments through which Rome ruthlessly reshaped Judea into something completely unrecognizable. The temple's ruin, the construction of imposing garrisons, the redrawing of borders, the imposition of new taxes and new laws, all of it unfolded under the watchful eyes of the boar-emblazoned legionaries. For many locals, Legio X was not simply an enemy. It was the very face of Rome itself. Their notorious ruthlessness during the Bar Kokhba revolt decades later only deepened that impression. This later uprising was fierce, well-organized, and far more widespread than the first rebellion. Judean fighters constructed elaborate underground networks, fortified caves, and highly disciplined units. Rome responded with overwhelming force, with multiple legions converging on the region. And in the center of that brutal storm, once again stood Legio Exfratensis. Hardened by years of harsh service, they methodically dismantled rebel strongholds, collapsed intricate cave systems, and relentlessly pursued fighters through the unforgiving deserts and ravines. When the rebellion finally snapped, the cost in lives and destroyed cities was unprecedented. The legion had helped to crush not just a revolt, but the very possibility of future independence. Afterward, the Roman authorities rebuilt the region into a new entity, a province renamed Syria Palestina. The old symbols were deliberately erased, the old ways severely restricted, and the old memories were ruthlessly smothered under Roman urban planning. And Legio X remained stationed in the new provincial capital, Aelia Capitolina, once Jerusalem, now a Roman colony complete with temples to Jupiter and public squares paved over destroyed neighborhoods. Even when centuries passed and the legion's veterans were long buried, their mark stubbornly survived. Coins bearing their boar emblem were still found in the soil, forts built by their engineers still clung to ridges and plains, and inscriptions carved by bored soldiers on stones and slabs still told fragmented stories of their long and brutal presence. And the memory of the wars they fought, the sieges they endured, the fires they set, and the destruction they wrought lived on in the stories of those who survived them. Legio Exfratensis was more than just a military unit. It was an era, a force that reshaped landscapes, cultures, and destinies. Its legacy was written not on parchment, but in the ashes of cities and the scars of a people who had endured its might. And centuries later, history still remembers the boar of Judea. By the 12th century, Europe's once quiet towns had transformed into noisy, competitive, and chaotic centers of trade. Carts jammed the narrow streets, workshops spilled noise and smoke into the alleys, foreign merchants unloaded goods at dawn, bakers shouted their prices, and tanners stank up entire districts. And in the middle of all this, craftsmen faced a growing problem. Freedom. Not the romantic kind, but the dangerous, unregulated kind where anyone could claim to be a carpenter, a butcher, a shoemaker, or, heaven forbid, a surgeon with nothing but a knife and confidence. Markets were swelling, but so were the risks. Fraudsters sold watered-down ale, Butchers stretched their meat supplies with tricks better left undescribed. Weavers copied patterns without skill, and newcomers, drawn from the countryside and slums, jumped into trades without training, undercutting prices and threatening established reputations. For a medieval craftsman, your name was everything. If customers no longer trusted the quality of your work, your entire livelihood collapsed. Something had to bring order to this growing chaos. The solution didn't come from kings or bishops. It came from the craftsmen themselves. They began forming sworn associations, groups of workers united not by blood or lordship, but by their shared trade. These were the first guilds, alliances built for survival in a world where markets grew faster than rules. At first, they were small circles of craftsmen agreeing on basic standards. A baker could not sell bread that crumbled to dust. A blacksmith could not forge horseshoes that snapped after 2 steps. And a shoemaker could not stitch leather so thin it tore in the rain. The guild protected all honest workers by ensuring that every member adhered to the same code of quality. But as towns expanded, so did the ambitions of the guilds. They realized that if they controlled quality, they might as well control everything else. Prices, training, competition, even who was allowed to practice a craft at all. What began as a pact of cooperation slowly hardened into a system of power. Joining a guild was no longer a casual matter. It was a privilege. Members swore solemn oaths, paid dues, attended meetings, and defended their shared interests like a close-knit brotherhood. Apprenticeships ensured that skills were passed down correctly. Journeymen traveled to learn from others, and masters oversaw standards and jealously protected their trade secrets. Anyone working outside the system became a direct threat, and the guilds crushed these threats with unwavering enthusiasm. In a world where kings ruled kingdoms and lords ruled lands, guilds ruled the streets, and their rise would reshape medieval life more profoundly than anyone expected. To truly understand how the guild system rose to power, you have to start at its beating heart, the training ladder. Medieval crafts weren't learned through books or classrooms. They were absorbed through sleepless nights, calloused hands, and years spent under the watchful eye of a master craftsman. And the guilds made sure that every craftsman, whether a baker, blacksmith, cooper, or goldsmith, followed the same rigorous path. It began with the apprentice, often a young boy as young as 10 or 12. His parents would negotiate a contract with a master, promising obedience in exchange for training, food, and a place to sleep, usually in the workshop itself. Apprenticeship was far from romantic. It was exhausting. They swept floors, chopped wood, stirred vats, fetched water, stretched hides, and endured endless scolding while learning the first fragile steps of their craft. But this harsh crucible forged unwavering loyalty. The guild valued discipline, tradition, and consistency, and apprentices absorbed all 3 before they were ever allowed to touch a tool unsupervised. After years, sometimes 7, the apprentice became a journeyman, literally a day worker. Now he was paid for his labor, free to travel, and able to work in different shops. Guilds actively encouraged this wandering. Journeymen carried techniques from town to town, spreading valuable skills like pollen. A Parisian stonemason might learn a valuable trick in Cologne, while a Flemish weaver might bring new patterns back from Florence. Trade routes became flowing rivers of shared knowledge, and the guilds carefully controlled the flow. Yet the journeyman faced a daunting finish line: becoming a master. This wasn't automatic. It required approval, the payment of fees, and above all, the creation of a masterpiece, a flawless item crafted to prove that he had truly mastered his craft. Some guilds demanded a chest with perfect joinery, a silver chalice without even the slightest dent, a loaf of bread with precisely the correct weight, or a shoe stitched so perfectly that it seemed to have grown rather than been made. Masters were the elite. They owned their own workshops, trained apprentices, set prices, and voted in guild councils. They guarded their techniques like precious treasure, a secret recipe, a precise dye formula, or a unique blade tempering method. These were secrets well worth protecting. The masters formed the very backbone of guild power, shaping not only their specific craft but the overall economic life of the city. This rigid ladder, apprentice, journeyman, master, created uniformity, stability, and pride, but it also created significant barriers. Outsiders, Innovators and unlicensed workers found the gates firmly closed. And those who dared to open their own workshops without permission soon learned that the guild brotherhood could be as crushing as it was protective. If medieval towns had kings and lords, the guilds had something even more frightening. Rules. Not loose guidelines or friendly suggestions, but strict, sworn codes that every member had to obey. These rules governed everything from how to bake bread to how to tan leather, how to measure cloth, how to set prices, and even how early a workshop could open its doors. In a world where chaos and relentless competition threatened livelihoods, the guilds created a fortress of order. To join a guild, a craftsman swore an oath public, solemn, and binding. These oaths weren't flowery or poetic. They were promises to uphold quality, protect trade secrets, respect fellow members, and meticulously follow regulations that could be astonishingly detailed. A guild of bakers might dictate the exact weight of a loaf, while a guild of butchers might specify which parts of an animal could be sold fresh and which had to be salted. A guild of goldsmiths insisted on rigorous purity tests, specific hallmarks, and regular inspections. Nothing was left to chance. This wasn't just about professional pride. It was about economic warfare. By establishing universal standards, the guilds made sure that no member could undercut the others by using cheaper materials or sloppy methods. If one shoemaker sold thin-soled boots that fell apart after a week, customers might start distrusting all shoemakers, and that was unacceptable. Quality wasn't simply a virtue. It was a vital defense mechanism. To enforce their extensive rules, the guilds appointed wardens or inspectors, men with the authority to walk into workshops unannounced and examine goods. If they uncovered fraud, they didn't just offer a lecture. They issued fines, confiscated goods, and publicly shamed the offenders. In extreme cases, they smashed substandard items in the street or expelled offenders from the guild entirely. And once expelled, a craftsman was finished. Without guild approval, no customer trusted you, and no workshop would hire you. Guild meetings, typically held in halls, taverns, or even churches, were essentially mini-parliaments. Masters debated market conditions, reviewed the progress of apprentices, set seasonal prices, and issued punishments. Some guilds maintained chests filled with emergency funds, essential tools, or vital documents, while others built chapels, commissioned elaborate altars, or funded lavish feasts. But behind all the camaraderie lay an iron core: control. The guild's power extended far beyond economics. It shaped social life, festivals, parades, and charity. It often overshadowed family ties, village loyalties, and sometimes even religious faith. A man's guild was his very identity, and violating its rules was treated as a deep personal betrayal. The system worked so effectively because it had teeth. The guilds didn't ask for obedience. They demanded it, and in return, they offered something priceless in the unpredictable medieval world: stability. By the 13th century, guilds were no longer just groups of craftsmen trying to maintain high standards. They were economic powerhouses that shaped entire towns. And nowhere was this more visible than in the bustling medieval markets. These markets weren't peaceful places. They were battlegrounds of shouting merchants, clashing interests, and endless competition. Without order, they would have quickly descended into complete chaos. With the guilds, they became carefully controlled ecosystems, strategically managed, rigorously regulated, and fiercely protected. Guilds didn't simply participate in markets. They dominated them. They claimed exclusive rights to produce and sell specific goods within the town walls. Bakers could sell bread only if they belonged to the Bakers' Guild. Blacksmiths could forge tools only with guild approval, and butchers could cut meat only under the watchful supervision of their guild. Even barbers, who acted half as haircutters and half as surgeons, operated within the established guild structures. If a craft existed, a guild eventually claimed it. This created monopolies that were both a blessing and a curse. For customers, a guild monopoly meant stable quality, predictable prices, and fewer dangerous surprises. Nobody wanted a badly shod horse, a weak beam in their home, or a physician who had learned his trade through reckless experimentation. Guild control kept such disasters at bay. But monopolies also inevitably led to protectionism. Guilds guarded their exclusive privileges like dragons guarding their treasure. No outsider, no matter how skilled, could simply set up a workshop without their express approval. Foreign merchants could sell goods only on certain days in certain zones under strict supervision. If a wandering tinker dared to repair pans inside the city limits without permission, guild officers seized his tools and marched him straight to court. This level of control extended to the physical layout of towns. The guilds often influenced where shops were located, how stalls were arranged, and which crafts clustered together. Some streets became permanently associated with specific trades, such as Goldsmith's Lane, Butcher's Row, or Shoemaker's Quarter. These weren't just convenient arrangements. They were strategic centers of power. Guild members patrolled markets, checked weights and measures, enforced fair practices, and reported any violations. They acted as economists, police officers, and local politicians all rolled into one. Their presence stabilized daily life but also inevitably created friction. Markets became like independent states with their own laws, emergencies, and political intrigues. Tensions inevitably rose whenever supply shortages hit, prices spiked, customers complained, and guilds scrambled to regulate production. Yet overall, guild monopolies turned cities into highly organized commercial engines that were predictable, prosperous, and safe enough for trade to truly flourish. But behind this carefully constructed order lurked the seeds of conflict. As the guilds tightened their grip, other powerful groups, including merchants, nobles, and even kings, began asking a dangerous question. Should guilds really have this much power? If guilds were only economic machines, their rise would have been impressive but ultimately short-lived. What made them so resilient, so deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, was the fact that they also functioned as tight-knit communities, almost like families bound not by blood, but by their shared craft, their shared pride, and their intricate rituals. To be part of a guild was to belong to something far larger than oneself, something that shaped a man's identity from the day he entered as a trembling apprentice to the day he was carried to his grave. Every guild had its own unique rituals, feasts, symbols, and patron saints. Bakers honored Saint Honoratus, masons worshipped under the protection of the Virgin Mary, and goldsmiths revered Saint Eligius. These weren't just decorative details. They were emotional anchors. In a world defined by uncertainty, famine, plague, war, and fire, guild rituals offered structure and a sense of spiritual reassurance. When a guild gathered at its altar for mass, members didn't see rivals or competitors. They saw brothers of the same craft. Guild feasts were legendary, funded by membership dues and fines. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced breads, and barrels of ale. These celebrations weren't simply excuses to drink and be merry. They reinforced the guild's rigid hierarchy. Masters sat at the high table, journeymen occupied the middle ranks, and apprentices were relegated to the edges. Every toast, every blessing, and every performance of a traditional guild song reminded members that they belonged to a structured and honorable lineage. Charity formed a crucial part of the guild's identity. Members contributed to funds that supported widows, the sick, the disabled, or craftsmen who had simply fallen on hard times. If a workshop, here is the English, U.S. translation, rewritten in an interpretive and clarifying style, having been burned down, the guild would rebuild. If a member passed away, the guild covered the burial expenses. And in the event an apprentice was orphaned, the guild acted as a surrogate guardian. Medieval society simply lacked social safety nets, so guilds stepped in to fill that void with remarkable generosity. Their guild halls, often impressive timber or stone structures, served multiple purposes beyond just meeting places. They functioned as political hubs, archives, banquet halls, and even courts. Within those walls, disputes were resolved internally, bypassing city authorities. Masters adjudicated conflicts among members, fines were levied, oaths were sworn, and decisions were handed down. The hall symbolized unity, authority, and the enduring nature of their craft. Parades and processions further solidified the guild's presence in the community. On feast days, guild members marched through town in their finest attire, banners waving, tools polished, chests puffed out with pride. This wasn't mere vanity. It was also a form of advertising, political theater, and a powerful reminder to onlookers of the esteemed and influential status of their craft. The medieval guild was more than just a workplace. It was a multifaceted institution, a brotherhood, a quasi-religious entity, a social club, a welfare system, and a political faction, all rolled into one. And this solidarity would soon set the stage for conflicts that went far beyond mere disagreements over bread or boots. As guilds accrued more authority, they inevitably clashed with another rising force in medieval towns, the merchant class. If craftsmen were the city's hands, merchants were its lifeblood, facilitating the flow of goods, money, and influence across Europe. For a time, both groups benefited from this arrangement. Guilds needed merchants to market their products, while merchants relied on guilds to ensure consistent quality. However, by the 13th century, tensions began to simmer beneath the surface, eventually erupting into open political warfare. The central conflict revolved around a fundamental question: who truly controlled the city? Guilds sought to protect their crafts and maintain their standards. Merchants, on the other hand, were focused on expanding trade and maximizing profits. While these goals might sound compatible at first glance, they were, in reality, often at odds. Merchants desired the freedom to buy and sell from anyone, anywhere, at the most advantageous price. Guilds insisted that all goods undergo their rigorous quality inspections, adhere to established price controls, and respect their monopolistic practices. To merchants, these guild restrictions felt like chains that stifled commerce. To guilds, the merchants' pursuit of unregulated freedom posed a grave threat to centuries of tradition and established standards. In many towns, this rivalry evolved into organized political factions. Merchant families formed councils, alliances, and cultivated their status as urban elites. Guilds responded by organizing themselves into coalitions, sometimes uniting dozens of different trades to counter merchant dominance. Town councils became battlegrounds where bakers, butchers, cobblers, and smiths debated against wealthy traders importing cloth from Bruges or spices from Venice. Some cities ultimately sided with the merchants. In places like Lübeck or Genoa, merchants controlled fleets, tax revenues, and international connections, effectively relegating guilds to secondary roles. But in other cities, such as Florence, Ghent, and Cologne, guilds seized control of city governments, transforming urban life into a world governed by craftsmen. This power struggle often turned violent. Florence, for example, witnessed the Ciampi Revolt, where wool workers rose up in protest against merchant oligarchs. In Ghent, guild militias paraded through the streets wielding axes and banners, demonstrating their power. In London, the ongoing tension between craft guilds and merchant guilds shaped city politics for generations. Medieval urban life was anything but calm. Beneath the sounds of ringing hammers and bustling markets lay a constant tug-of-war over authority. Despite the conflict, both sides were undeniably interdependent. A merchant without goods to sell was powerless, while a craftsman without buyers was equally ineffective. Their rivalry thus created a paradox. Cities thrived most when these two forces maintained a balance, keeping both unchecked ambition and stifling regulation in check. However, this equilibrium was fragile, and economic crises, plagues, and political shifts could dramatically alter the balance of power. By the 14th century, the world was on the cusp of dramatic change, which would usher guilds into a golden age, followed by a long decline. For all their talk of brotherhood and solidarity, guilds were far from open systems. They were gatekeepers, polished, ritualized, respected gatekeepers, but gatekeepers nonetheless. And this exclusionary nature was nowhere more evident than in their treatment of women, migrants, and unlicensed workers. The medieval guild system may have profoundly shaped entire towns, but it certainly didn't shape them equitably. Women's roles varied greatly across Europe. In many crafts, brewing, textile work, baking, women were indispensable. They spun wool, brewed ale, stitched garments, and managed market stalls. In some areas, they even inherited workshops or continued the business after their husbands' deaths. Yet, despite their significant contributions, guild leadership rarely welcomed them as equals. Women might appear in records as craftswomen, brewers, or alewives, but they were frequently barred from full membership and excluded from voting, holding office, or training apprentices. There were exceptions, of course. Certain guilds, particularly in the textile centers of Flanders or the brewing towns of England, permitted women limited membership or partial rights. However, even in these cases, the guild's upper echelons remained overwhelmingly male. The system relied heavily on family labor and the contributions of wives and daughters, but official power remained firmly in the hands of men. Migrants faced a different kind of exclusion. Growing towns attracted workers from the countryside, refugees fleeing wars, and ambitious craftsmen seeking better opportunities. However, guilds tightly controlled who could join their ranks. Admission fees were high, the apprenticeship process was lengthy, and local favoritism was rampant. Outsiders could only find work as assistants or day laborers, never rising to the rank of master without a local sponsor. In response, unlicensed workers emerged, craftsmen who operated outside guild regulations. Some repaired shoes in back alleys, while others forged nails in hidden workshops. Many were simply poor individuals trying to make a living. Guilds labeled them interlopers, foreigners, or illegal craftsmen and fought them relentlessly. Wardens raided their shops, seized their tools, imposed fines, or publicly humiliated them as a warning to others. Yet, despite these efforts, guilds couldn't completely eliminate them. As cities expanded, the demand for cheap labor grew, and unlicensed workers quietly, unofficially, and often dangerously filled that need. Their lack of regulation, however, meant poor training and low-quality goods. Tensions simmered. Guilds despised them, townspeople relied on them, and authorities had to strike a balance between guild strictness and urban necessities. These marginalized groups, women, migrants, and unlicensed craftsmen, lived in the shadow of guild dominance. They were essential yet excluded, contributing to a commercial world that rarely acknowledged their role. As the 14th century approached, these tensions at the fringes of the system would become impossible to ignore. The 14th century arrived like a hammer blow, bringing war, famine, and economic turmoil that shattered the stability medieval towns had slowly built. Yet, nothing had a more devastating impact than the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe, killing between a third and half of the population, it didn't just end lives, it decimated the labor market. Workshops were left deserted. Masters died along with their entire households, journeymen fled, and apprentices vanished. Streets once filled with the sounds of hammers and market cries fell into an eerie silence. Paradoxically, this catastrophe became the moment of greatest guild power. Guilds had always controlled the labor supply, but now labor was scarce, which translated into unprecedented leverage. Surviving craftsmen found themselves in high demand. Journeymen could demand higher wages, apprenticeship terms shifted in their favor, and masters gained even greater control as towns begged them to restore production. Governments, desperate for stability, leaned heavily on guilds to regulate prices and prevent chaos. For a brief period, guilds became the unquestioned arbiters of economic life. But with increased power came increased responsibilities and new conflicts. Across Europe, guilds stepped in to repair collapsing economies. They imposed emergency price controls to prevent gouging, redistributed tools and materials from abandoned workshops, and coordinated rebuilding efforts, particularly in industries crucial to survival: baking, smithing, brewing, milling. Some guilds even opened their coffers to support widows and orphans, while others enforced strict curfews to prevent looting during plague outbreaks. Yet, beneath this veneer of order, new struggles simmered. Journeymen, newly empowered by labor shortages, pushed back against masters, demanding higher pay or shorter workdays. Some even formed brotherhoods, proto-unions, that directly challenged the guild hierarchy. Masters, threatened by this rising assertiveness, tightened entry rules, raised fees, and defended their authority with renewed ferocity. Cities, desperate to restore normalcy, sided with the guilds, relying on their courts to mediate disputes and their funds to rebuild infrastructure. Civic governments increasingly included guild representatives, giving craftsmen a political voice they'd never had before. In some towns, guilds effectively ran the government, creating administrations composed of bakers, butchers, weavers, and tanners instead of aristocrats or merchants. But this moment of peak influence also revealed the system's inherent weaknesses. Innovation slowed under increasingly tight regulations. As demand surged, guilds often resisted new techniques that threatened traditional methods. Their strict control kept chaos at bay, but it also stifled experimentation. The plague had reshaped Europe, and guilds, stronger than ever, stood at the center of this transformed world, powerful, respected, but also increasingly rigid. The stage was set for the final act, their eventual decline. By the late 14th century, the guild system, once the engine of medieval urban life, stood at the height of its prestige. Guild halls dominated city squares, guild leaders sat on councils, and guild rituals shaped holidays and public life. But like many institutions that reach their peak, the system soon began to crack under the pressure of a rapidly changing world. The very strengths that had made guilds powerful, control, tradition, exclusivity, became weaknesses. As Europe entered a new age, the first challenge came from expanding markets. Trade extended beyond the walls of individual towns. Merchant networks connected London to Bruges, Florence to Cairo, Lubeck to Novgorod. Goods flowed faster and farther than ever before. Guild monopolies, once essential for stability, now appeared as obstacles slowing down commerce. Foreign cloth might be cheaper, imported metal tools sharper, new dyes more vivid, but guilds fought to block them all, clinging to tradition even when customers craved change. The second challenge was technology. Innovations in weaving, metallurgy, and mechanics emerged across Europe. But guilds, protective of their established methods, often resisted new tools that threatened the old order. A loom that allowed one man to work faster? Suspicious. A new brewing technique? Potentially dangerous. A better way to tan leather? Probably banned. Innovation existed, but guilds tried to control it so tightly that progress slowed. Then came political shifts. Kings strengthened centralized governments and no longer wished to share authority with independent urban guilds. Monarchs sided with merchants, granted trade privileges, and licensed new industries without guild approval. Some rulers even dissolved guild power in certain trades, arguing that economic growth required freedom, not regulation. But the most transformative force was the early rise of capitalism. Wealthy merchants, no longer mere traders but investors, began financing large-scale operations. Cloth halls, metal workshops, banking houses, mining ventures. These enterprises needed free labor, not guild restrictions. They employed workers directly, bypassing guild hierarchies entirely. Wages replaced master-apprentice bonds. Production scaled beyond what traditional shops could match. As the 15th century approached, guilds found themselves increasingly sidelined. They still held influence, still trained craftsmen, still organized festivals, but they no longer controlled economic life. The world had grown too large, too fast, too interconnected for their old rules. Yet their legacy endured. The apprenticeship model survived into modern trades. Standards for quality and consumer protection can trace their roots to guild regulations. Even modern labor unions resemble the journeyman brotherhoods that defied masters centuries earlier. The guilds did not vanish. They transformed. What began as medieval brotherhoods left behind a blueprint for professional identity, collective bargaining, craftsmanship, and community that still resonates throughout the working world today. She entered history not as a princess or noblewoman, but as a nameless girl dragged across the cold plains of Ruthenia. Born around 1502, somewhere within the lands controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, she grew up in a world shaped by border raids, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of Tatar slavers. One of those raids irrevocably changed her life. Taken prisoner as a young teenager, she was forced south along the slave routes that fed the markets of Crimea, a conduit of human lives destined for the Ottoman Empire. Most vanished into anonymity, but Roxolana would not. When she arrived in Istanbul, she was not led into a dungeon but into a palace so vast it might as well have been its own world. The Topkapi Palace. There, behind towering walls and guarded gates, lay the imperial harem, a society within a society, a political machine disguised as a residence for women. Outsiders imagined it as a place of luxury, but insiders knew it as a battlefield of hierarchy, education, discipline, and intrigue. Every girl was trained to serve, to obey, and to survive. Few ever rose above the lowest ranks. Roxolana's arrival was unremarkable on the surface. A foreign captive, red-haired and sharp-eyed, she entered at the very bottom. But the women around her quickly noticed something unusual about her. She was cheerful, strangely, defiantly cheerful. Where others bowed their heads, she met gazes directly. Where others spoke softly, she spoke with a spark that bordered on audacity. Beneath her bright demeanor was a razor-sharp mind, absorbing languages, etiquette, music, poetry, and the unspoken politics of palace life. To survive the harem, a girl needed discipline. To rise, she needed brilliance. Roxolana possessed both, along with something even more dangerous: ambition. The imperial harem was governed by a strict order, with ranks leading from servant to concubine to favorite, and, in the rarest of cases, from favorite to mother of a prince. The path was narrow and fraught with peril. Rivalries festered, and alliances shifted overnight. Every smile could conceal a dagger. Yet, Roxolana adapted with unnatural speed. She earned trust, learned the palace's rhythms, and observed the women who wielded influence. Slowly, the currents began to shift around her. She had arrived as a slave, but even then, before she ever met Suleiman, she was already embarking on a path that would overturn centuries of Ottoman tradition. She had entered the palace as a captive, but she would not remain one for long. For most women in the imperial harem, life revolved around discipline, obedience, and invisibility. The greatest talent a concubine could possess was quiet perfection, moving gracefully, serving flawlessly, and never drawing unwanted attention. But Hurrem, still known to many as Roxolana, seemed destined to disrupt that world. She smiled too much, laughed too freely, and spoke with a brightness that unsettled the calculated stillness of palace life. Eventually, this very uniqueness drew her into the orbit of the one man no concubine dared dream of capturing: Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. When Suleiman first summoned her, it should have been a moment of terror. Sultans typically chose a girl once, occasionally twice, rarely thrice before moving on. The encounter could elevate her for a night but meant little for the future. However, Hurrem behaved unlike anyone he had ever summoned. Instead of trembling speechlessness, she greeted him with a kind of bold joy, equal parts innocence and wit. Rather than treating the Sultan as a distant son, she treated him as a man who could be spoken to, teased, and engaged with directly. Suleiman, a ruler hardened by campaigns and weighty responsibilities, was disarmed. Their exchange did not follow the script the court expected. She asked questions, smiled as though she had no comprehension of the centuries of protocol that said she shouldn't. In a place where even a tone of voice could be scrutinized for disrespect, Hurrem leaned into her natural charm without hesitation, and it worked. Suleiman left that first meeting unsettled, intrigued, and above all, eager to see her again. And he did. Night after night, he summoned her, and night after night, she greeted him with the same mixture of fearless conversation, warmth, and intelligence. Soon, she was no longer merely a concubine. She became a favorite, and favorites held a dangerous, potent kind of influence. The harem noticed. Whispered envy turned into sharpened hostility. Other women who had spent years cultivating perfection now watched this foreign girl ascend with impossible speed. Yet Hurrem seemed untouched by fear. She understood an unspoken truth. Capturing a sultan's heart was the strongest shield in the empire. Suleiman, a poet and philosopher as much as a conqueror, found in her not just beauty but a mind capable of matching his own. What began as a simple knight grew into a partnership. What began as a summons grew into devotion. Hurrem had achieved the unthinkable. She made the sultan fall in love. In the Ottoman world, a concubine's power did not stem from beauty or wit, but from bearing a son. A prince was the greatest currency a woman could offer, the only guarantee that she would not be cast aside when the Sultan's attention shifted. Hurrem understood this perfectly, and when she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed, everything changed. She had crossed the threshold from favorite to mother of a Saitzad, a prince. That title alone elevated her above most of the harem. But she didn't stop there. Over the following years, Hurrem bore multiple children, sons and daughters, something unprecedented. Ottoman tradition dictated that once a concubine bore a son, she was sent to the prince's provincial court, never again to share the sultan's bed. This prevented women from accumulating too much influence, kept power balanced, and preserved the ancient rotational system. Suleiman shattered that system for her. He kept Hurrem at the palace, continued visiting her, and had more children with her. Salim, Bayezid, Sahanger, and Marima, the daughter who would become her closest political ally. With every birth, Hurrem's position strengthened, but so did the danger. The Ottoman succession system was brutal. Sons of different mothers competed fiercely for the throne, and mothers, in turn, competed for survival. A prince's loss meant death, exile, or strangulation, fates that often swept away his mother as well. Hurrem was surrounded by rivals, chief among them Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. Mustafa was popular, charismatic, and the heir apparent, and his mother believed her path to power was guaranteed. Hurrem threatened everything. Their rivalry was more than personal. It was existential. Within the palace walls, alliances formed and dissolved like storm clouds. Eunuchs, tutors, concubines, and advisors each chose sides. Every gesture, every rumor, every glance carried political weight. Survival depended on strategy, and Hurrem's intelligence became her armor. She built networks among the palace servants, befriended scholars, charmed foreign ambassadors, and cultivated a reputation for piety and charity. She positioned herself as both mother and moral guardian. The public began to see her not as a concubine but as a dignified figure, a presence with purpose. Inside the harem, however, she was a master tactician. She knew that the greatest threat to her children was Mustafa and, therefore, Mahidevran. The contest for influence intensified, setting the stage for the most turbulent relationships of Suleiman's reign. Hurrem had risen from slave to mother of multiple princes. But in the Ottoman Empire, motherhood was only the beginning. The true battle was for the future itself. As Hurrem's influence grew, so did the fury of her enemies. Her unprecedented rise defied centuries of custom and threatened the delicate balance of power within the palace. No rivalry embodied this more fiercely than her conflict with Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. Their feud was not a petty disagreement between women. It was a collision of dynastic futures. Mahidevran had once been Suleiman's favored companion. She had occupied the position Hurrem now held, and she believed herself destined to become the mother of the next sultan. Mustafa was strong, admired, and deeply respected by the army, especially the Janissaries. To many, his future on the throne seemed assured. But Hurrem's arrival destabilized everything. With every new child she bore, with every audience she gained, with every whisper that reached Suleiman's ear, Mustafa's seemingly inevitable rise became less certain. The harem braced itself for a storm. The infamous confrontation between Hurrem and Mahidevran, where Mahidevran allegedly attacked Hurrem in a fit of rage, was more than a personal conflict. It became a symbolic moment. Hurrem emerged wounded but victorious, and Suleiman, enraged by the assault, distanced himself from Mahidevran forever. From that moment onward, Hurrem's ascent accelerated. But Hurrem was no fool. She knew that a wounded rival was more dangerous than a confident one. Mahidevran still had Mustafa, and Mustafa had the loyalty of the military. To survive, Hurrem needed to strengthen her own support network. She began cultivating alliances beyond the harem walls, something women rarely achieved. She befriended rivals of the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, corresponded with foreign diplomats, and won influence among scholars and jurists. She used charity as a political weapon, funding soup kitchens, mosques, and hospitals. Her generosity earned her a reputation for piety and compassion, a subtle counterweight to the poisonous rumors spread by her rivals. Yet, Hurrem also understood the power of psychology. She crafted letters that appealed to Suleiman's emotions, portraying herself as loyal, tender, and vulnerable. These letters, preserved today, reveal a woman who had mastered the art of emotional diplomacy. But beneath the soft language was a strategist with clear objectives: protect her children, undermine Mustafa's faction, and reshape the palace's power hierarchy. Her moves were subtle, patient, and calculated. She played a long game, understanding that Suleiman's heart was her greatest shield, but also her greatest responsibility. The harem was no longer merely a residence. Under Hurrem's presence, it had become a political battlefield, and she was emerging as its undeniable commander. By the mid-16th century, Hurrem Sultan had already defied the expectations placed on any concubine. She had risen from foreign captive to mother of multiple princes, from palace outsider to Suleiman's closest companion. But the transformation that came next shattered an even deeper pillar of Ottoman political tradition, one that had stood unchallenged for centuries. Suleiman married her. To the outside world, this event was nothing short of revolutionary. Ottoman sultans did not take legal wives. Marriage tied a ruler to a single woman and her family, creating dynastic alliances that could weaken or constrain imperial authority. Concubinage, by contrast, ensured flexibility, prevented powerful marriage ties, and allowed the dynasty to continue without foreign influence. Every sultan before Suleiman had maintained this system. Suleiman broke it for Hurrem. The wedding was kept discreet within the palace, but the shockwaves spread instantly. Istanbul buzzed with rumors. Why would the sultan formalize his relationship with a slave girl? What power did she wield? Was it love, politics, or magic? Exaggerated theories spread across the empire. But one truth was undeniable. Hurrem was no longer merely the joyful one. She was the sultan's legal wife and entered history as Haseki Sultan, the highest-ranking woman in the empire. Marriage granted Hurrem unprecedented authority. Her influence over Suleiman, already strong, now became institutionalized. She acquired her own court, her own income, and her own political network. She began corresponding with foreign monarchs, letters that astonished diplomats with their clarity and confidence. She was treated as royalty, not a concubine, as a partner, not an ornament. Her signature appeared on charitable foundations, legal documents, and orders for vast architectural projects. But her elevation also intensified the danger around her. The court's elite viziers, advisors, harem leaders, and foreign ambassadors watched her with suspicion. Traditionalists muttered that the empire was being reshaped by a woman's whims. Enemies whispered that she had bewitched Suleiman, twisting him away from ancient customs. Hurrem was fully aware of the risks. Legitimacy gave her protection, but it also gave her visibility. Every decision she made, every alliance she forged, every whisper she uttered would be scrutinized. She responded with elegance and precision. She wielded the tools of royalty: charity, diplomacy, letters, architecture. She transformed her public image from favored concubine into queenly benefactor, building mosques, schools, public baths, and soup kitchens throughout Istanbul. The marriage marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. For the first time in Ottoman history, a woman stood beside the sultan, not as a shadow, but as a partner. No moment in Hurrem Sultan's life is more infamous or more debated than the downfall of Prince Mustafa. It was the turning point that cemented her reputation as brilliant to some and ruthless to others. Whether she orchestrated it fully or simply influenced the course of events, one truth is clear: the stakes had never been higher. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son, a figure beloved by the Janissaries, respected throughout the provinces, and admired even by foreign ambassadors. He possessed charisma, military talent, and was widely seen as the heir apparent, the perfect successor to lead the empire. However, to Hurrem, Mustafa represented an existential threat. His ascension would inevitably lead to the elimination of her own sons, a consequence of the Ottoman succession's brutal but established rules. Hurrem couldn't ignore this reality, nor could her closest political ally, Rustam Pasha, her son-in-law and the Grand Vizier. Together, they forged a strategic partnership that would indelibly reshape the empire's future. Rumors began to circulate, subtle, insidious, and ultimately devastating. Whispers suggested Mustafa was plotting rebellion, that he maintained secret correspondence with the empire's enemies, and that his popularity with the army was excessive. In an empire where succession plots were not uncommon but rather expected, these rumors didn't seem far-fetched. They resonated with a sense of plausibility. Whether Hurrem initiated these rumors or simply amplified existing anxieties, Suleiman's trust in Mustafa began to erode. Burdened by decades of war and personal loss, the Sultan grew increasingly wary of betrayal, haunted by memories of past palace coups. The idea of a rebellious prince was not unthinkable. It was, sadly, a historical pattern. The decisive moment arrived in 1553. As Suleiman marched to quell a revolt in Persia, Mustafa, intending to demonstrate his loyalty, rode to join the campaign with confidence. Instead of a warm welcome, he was met with accusations and suspicion, not the embrace of a father. Summoned to his father's tent, Mustafa entered alone, unaware of the executioners waiting behind the curtain. The ensuing struggle was brief. The empire's most beloved prince was strangled with a silken bowstring. News of Mustafa's death sent shockwaves across the empire. Soldiers wept openly. Foreign courts recoiled in horror. The Janissaries murmured with barely suppressed anger, and Hurrem's name became inextricably linked to the tragedy. Some branded her the mastermind, others the scapegoat, but all acknowledged her profound influence. For her sons, Mustafa's death cleared the path to the throne. For the empire, it signaled the beginning of internal divisions that would plague Suleiman's final years. And for Hurrem, it marked the point of no return, where she stepped irrevocably into the heart of imperial destiny, forever abandoning the safety of the harem. By the time Prince Mustafa was gone, Hurrem Sultan stood at the zenith of her power. No woman before her had ever wielded such influence. She was no longer simply Suleiman's beloved wife or the mother of princes. She had become a political force whose decisions reverberated from the palace halls to the empire's most distant provinces. And unlike many who attained such heights of power, Hurrem didn't simply bask in it. She actively wielded it. Her primary arena was diplomacy. While most royal women elsewhere in the world remained silent figures, Hurrem penned letters to foreign rulers, kings of Poland, shahs of Persia, even European ambassadors, expressing concern, advocating for peace, offering condolences, and commenting on international events. Her correspondence revealed intelligence, charm, and a keen strategic mind. She engaged not as a hidden figure, but as a partner in governance. Diplomats were taken aback, some praising her, others fearing her, but none dismissing her. Her second arena was charity and public works. Hurrem understood that power was reinforced not only by alliances but also by public perception. She commissioned grand architectural projects, including mosques, schools, bathhouses, soup kitchens, and caravanserais, stretching from Istanbul to Jerusalem. Her most famous endeavor was the Haseki Hurrem Sultan Complex, HHSK, a sprawling institution providing shelter, education, and medical care to thousands. Through these projects, Hurrem cultivated a legacy that touched the lives of ordinary people, softening her image as a political manipulator and solidifying her role as a protector of the vulnerable. However, her influence also extended to the inner workings of the palace. She understood the delicate balance between the powerful eunuchs, viziers, and pashas. Rustam Pasha, her trusted ally and son-in-law, remained Grand Vizier, granting her a direct voice in imperial decisions. Through him, she influenced military campaigns, tax reforms, and diplomatic strategies. Their partnership blurred the lines between harem politics and statecraft, establishing a new paradigm of female power within the empire. Within the palace walls, Hurrem reformed the harem structure itself. She reorganized roles, ensured better training for servants and concubines, and cultivated loyalty through a combination of kindness and calculated generosity. Under her guidance, the harem transformed from a mere residence into a disciplined, efficient, and politically connected institution. The empire was changing around her. What had once been a male-dominated realm of military campaigns and council meetings was now influenced by a woman who had begun her life as a slave. Hurrem didn't simply navigate the Ottoman court. She reshaped it, laying the groundwork for an era known as the Sultanate of Women, a period when imperial mothers and wives would guide politics for generations to come. Her power was immense, her reach undeniable, but the cost of such influence was yet to be fully realized. As the years passed, the brilliant flame of Hurrem Sultan's rise began to flicker, not because her power diminished, but because the burdens of time, grief, and illness weighed heavily upon her. Even at the height of her authority, she existed within a court defined by tension. The death of Prince Mustafa had secured her son's futures, but had also fractured the empire. Soldiers murmured discontent. Advisors whispered suspicions. The Janissaries never fully forgave her. Every decision Suleiman made was now scrutinized through the lens of Hurrem's potential influence. And yet, she remained indispensable. Her closest allies, most notably Rustam Pasha, occupied key positions. Her children were now adults, each with their own courts and ambitions. Miraima, her daughter, had become her political echo, intelligent, poised, and fiercely loyal. Together, mother and daughter acted as a dual force in Suleiman's emotional landscape, advising him during moments of uncertainty and supporting him through the losses that marked his later reign. However, Hurrem's health began to decline. Letters from this period reveal a woman who was still sharp and resolute but also weary, battling waves of pain and chronic illness. Despite her failing health, she refused to retreat. She continued to oversee her charitable foundations, mediate political disputes, send instructions to her allies, and guide her sons, particularly Selim and Bayezid, whose rivalry was beginning to mirror the dangerous patterns of Ottoman succession struggles. As her strength waned, she worked tirelessly to ensure the empire's stability beyond her lifetime. She strengthened Miraima's political role, encouraged Rustam Pasha to maintain a firm grip on state affairs, and desperately tried to maintain peace between her sons. However, the underlying tensions within the empire could not be suppressed indefinitely. Selim was indulgent but politically reliable. Bayezid was passionate and popular, perhaps too popular. The specter of another succession conflict loomed large, and Hurrem was acutely aware of it. Her relationship with Suleiman remained strong until the very end. He visited her often, sought her counsel, and shared his private sorrows with her, the death of their son Sahangar, the exhaustion of long campaigns, the old wounds that time never fully healed. Their bond, which had begun as an improbable romance between a sultan and a slave girl, had evolved into a lifelong partnership. In 1558, Hurrem's body finally succumbed. The woman who had shaped an empire from behind lattice screens died in Istanbul, leaving behind a political landscape she had helped construct and a dynasty forever transformed by her presence. Her death sent ripples of unease through the palace, but her influence did not vanish. The world she had created would persist long after her final breath. When Hurrem Sultan passed away in 1558, a sudden, uneasy silence descended upon the palace. The woman who had once arrived as a trembling captive was now buried in a mausoleum beside Suleiman's future tomb, an honor unprecedented for a concubine, a monument declaring that she had stood as his partner, not his possession. However, her death was not an ending. It was a beginning. The empire she left behind had been permanently reshaped by her hand. Her influence continued, first through her children. Selim, her son, eventually succeeded Suleiman, becoming Selim II. His ascension marked the triumph of Hurrem's political strategy, a long and perilous game she had been playing since the birth of her first child. Miraima, her daughter, naturally assumed her mother's role as a key political advisor, forging alliances and offering counsel with the same steady composure Hurrem had instilled in her. Even after Rustam Pasha's death, the political network Hurrem had established continued to function, guided now by Miraima's intelligence and experience. However, Hurrem's most enduring legacy was structural. She had shattered the barrier separating the harem from state politics. Before her, the women of the harem lived behind curtains, their power limited to whispers. After her, they became visible actors in imperial decision-making. Her life paved the way for the era historians would later dub the Sultanate of Women, a century-long period during which imperial mothers, daughters, and wives shaped diplomacy, architecture, education, and the very succession of sultans. Under her influence, the very concept of royal womanhood in the Ottoman Empire was redefined. Charity became political capital, patronage became influence, letters became weapons, and motherhood became a governing institution. The Haseki Sultan, once a ceremonial title, became a cornerstone of statecraft. Yet, her legacy was also a subject of controversy. Critics accused her of destabilizing the succession, manipulating Suleiman, and contributing to the empire's internal rivalries. Supporters viewed her as a genius of statecraft, an outsider who had mastered the world's most formidable court and reshaped it with intelligence, loyalty, and strategic brilliance. Both perspectives held a degree of truth. Herm's power protected her family, but it also irrevocably altered the empire's political landscape. Ultimately, her story reveals the paradox of her life. She was a slave who became a queen, a foreigner who became the beating heart of the empire, a woman who transformed private influence into public power. Her rise defied tradition, her strategies revolutionized dynastic politics, and her legacy endured long after her voice was silenced. Hurrem Sultan did not simply live in history, she became an integral part of it.